The idea of improving humanity, a notion once used to justify sterilisation and genocide, was not unique to Hitler.
Content warning. This video discusses issues and contains images that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is recommended.
And it certainly did not disappear after World War II. It receded into something even more insidious as the idea of the perfect human slid into spiritual movement and cults, shaping unsuspecting lives in covert ways. In this video, I'll cover a brief overview of Eugenics in Western society, details of Australia's Eurogenic legacy, a definition of spiritual Eugenics, the roots of Western spiritual Eugenics in Greek philosophy, spiritual Eugenics in Christianity, spiritual Eugenics in New Age movements and other high-demand groups, the us versus them mentality, belief systems that oppose spiritual Eugenics, and the creative paradigm as an alternative. To start, let's cover the dark legacy of Eugenics with a brief history of where it started and its impact. Eugenics was a term coined in 1883 by Francis Galton. It emerged as a movement aimed at improving the human race by accelerating evolution by encouraging reproduction among those with desirable traits and discouraging it among those who were deemed undesirable. The belief system was inspired by Darwin's theory of natural selection. These days, Eugenics is considered to be a pseudoscience. However, in its heyday, it had a strong cult following due to the appeal of the hierarchical listing of human traits that ranged from superior to inferior. To bolster the scientific credibility, it drew upon themes from phonology, which is another pseudoscience that emerged in the late 19th century and tried to link personality traits with features of the skull as indicators of intelligence and moral character. Not surprisingly, it was those whom Eugenic ranked as the highest, that is, those within the upper class white Anglo-Saxon descent, who supported the ideology the most because it aligned with their personal values. Eugenics also spread rapidly because it was framed as scientific and it was backed by many academics, which in turn led to it being supported by governments around the world. In the early 20th century, Eugenics gained traction worldwide. In the United States, forced sterilizations, segregations, and marriage restrictions were common, with over 60,000 people sterilized under state laws. Europe also embraced eugenics, with sterilisation programs in Scandinavian countries and policies in the UK that targeted individuals and labelled them as mentally deficient. The darkest chapter in eugenics unfolded in Nazi Germany, where policies included forced sterilizations, euthanasia, and the Holocaust. After World War II, eugenics was widely condemned, but its ideologies persisted, evolving into subtler forms, including spiritual eugenics. Although less widely discussed, Australia implemented some shocking policies, particularly in the early 20th century. While there was no overarching federal eugenics law, the Immigration Act of 1901, better known as the White Australian Policy, shared the same racial hierarchy and exclusion goals that are central to eugenic thought. Australia's discrimination in immigration policies were not fully deconstructed until 1973. During that period, societal attitudes resulted in widespread implementation of eugenic practices across the country. A notable example is Tasmania's Mental Deficiency Act of 1920, which was modelled after the United Kingdom's 1913 legislation. This act established the State Psychological Clinic and the Mental Deficiency Board as being responsible for diagnosing and overseeing individuals classified into categories such as idiots, imbeciles, and feeble-minded. These classifications often led to the institutionalisation or guardianship, reflecting the eugenic goal of preventing those considered to be unfit from reproducing. The Act remained in effect until it was repealed in 1968. Organisations such as the Racial Hygiene Association of New South Wales promoted eugenic ideas nationwide. which embedded these ideologies into Australian society. In the state of Victoria, there were no specific eugenics legislations. However, the influence of the ideologies persisted in various social policies and practices, particularly affecting those in marginalised communities. Notably, Dr. Richard Berry, a prominent autonomist at the University of Melbourne, was a leading proponent of eugenics during this period. Around the country, subtle forms of eugenics were evident in the institutionalisation of the mentally ill within various asylums and places like Larundel, which were not only a response to medical concerns, but also a product of eugenic thinking, which sought to control and limit the lives of those deemed unfit for society. These institutions became places of confinement where individuals were subjected to experimental treatments and social exclusion under the guise of supposedly improving the human race. These sometimes barbaric treatments of individuals at these institutions did a lot more harm than good. Policies often framed as public health measures or efforts to protect society included forced sterilisations. Australia didn't necessarily enact widespread sterilisation laws like the US and some European countries. However, there are some documented cases of forced sterilisation, particularly targeting Indigenous women. And of course, there is the stolen generations, which was the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families, which was justified as a way of getting them to assimilate into white society, which was deeply rooted in eugenic thinking. These policies aim to breed out Indigenous cultures and identities. The institutionalisation of white fellas happened to many individuals with disabilities or mental health, who were placed in institutions under the guise of preventing them from reproducing. So a person with depression or anxiety could easily find themselves in this situation. And since PTSD and trauma responses in general were not well understood, women were often overrepresented in these places due to being labelled as hysterics, or maybe they displayed sexual behaviour that was deemed to be immoral by prudish patriarchal standards. Although these policies have been officially condemned, their legacy continues to impact marginalised communities in Australia today. So in summary, Australian eugenics primarily targeted marginalised groups such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people with disabilities, and those deemed mentally deficient. Throughout history, various social groups and movements have consistently opposed eugenic principles, emphasising the intrinsic value and dignity of all human beings. Religious organisations like the Quakers and some Christian denominations advocated for the sanctity of life and rejected the ranking of people based on perceived fitness. In Australia, several groups consistently opposed eugenic principles and fought for equality, often advocating for the protection of marginalised communities targeted by eugenic policies. Labour and social movements were among the first to criticise eugenics, viewing it as a tool to reinforce class and racial hierarchies. These movements argued that eugenic policies disproportionately impacted the working class, immigrants, and Indigenous Australians, reinforcing social inequities. Feminist groups, particularly those focused on reproduction rights, also resisted eugenics, especially the efforts to control women's bodies through forced sterilisation and restrictions on reproductive choices. Women's organisations such as the Women's Christian Tolerance Union spoke out against the harmful effects of eugenic policies on working class women and those from non-European backgrounds. Then there were the Indigenous rights activists, including figures like William Cooper and Jack Patton, who fought against eugenic practices that sought to breed out Aboriginal Australians or forcibly sterilise them. Disability rights activists such as the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations strongly opposed eugenics for its devaluation of people with disabilities, advocating instead for inclusion and equal rights and access to education and employment. Religious groups, particularly the Catholic Church, rejected eugenics for its violation of the sanctity of life, and intellectual critics in the field like sociology and ethics challenged the pseudoscientific basis of eugenic policies. These diverse groups work together to oppose eugenics in Australia, promoting human dignity, social justice, and equality for all individuals, regardless of race, class, disability, and even gender. Now on to spiritual eugenics. What is spiritual eugenics? Unlike biological eugenics, which focuses on biological factors, spiritual eugenics aims to improve humanity's moral and spiritual qualities. A definite origin of the first usage of the term spiritual eugenics remains a little bit unclear. However, it does come up as a contemporary term from time to time, used to describe ideologies or practices that adapt eugenic principles that are related to metaphysical contexts or spiritual superiority. This idea of spiritual superiority has actually appeared quite often throughout history, often linked to religious or philosophical movements. In the West, this can be really clearly linked back to ancient philosophers like Plato's Republic, in which there is advocation for a covert state control over reproduction. This was defined in terms of assigning the values of gold, silver, bronze, and iron to qualities aligned with levels of intelligence, because nous was considered to be a spiritual quality back then. The exact relevant passage from Plato is as follows: "For all of you in the city are brothers, but the God, in fashioning those of who are fit to rule, mixed gold into their generation. This is why they are the most honourable. Into the auxiliaries he mixed silver and iron and bronze, and into the farmers and other craftsmen." This allegorical presentation, told in what is known as the myth of metals, serves to explain that while people are born to different natures, gold, silver, bronze, or iron, these natures are not strictly hereditary. A gold parent may produce a bronze child and vice versa, symbolising the fluidity of talent and virtue across generations. It emphasises that rulers, the ones with the golden souls, should be chosen based on their abilities and nature, not merely their birth. Plato's hierarchical framework assumes a rigid stratification of individuals based on inherent qualities like intellect and virtue, which he equated with their metallic composition. However, this model fails to account for the diverse forms of intelligence and abilities that modern understandings of neurodiversity recognise. By privileging certain types of intellect, this framework marginalises other cognitive and emotional strengths such as creativity, empathy, and adaptive problem solving. Furthermore, it risks perpetrating an elitist view that equates worth with conformity to a narrow standard of intelligence, whereby devaluing individuals whose abilities do not align with these criteria. This assumption of superiority undermines the principles of inclusivity and equity, ignoring the complexity and interdependence of human capacities in fostering a just and functional society. Nonetheless, this Platonic notion, which was extended in Aristotle's Politics, in which he advocates for selecting rulers based on a spiritual hierarchy in which certain educated men are deemed to possess superior soul qualities that give them divine authority to rule over others. The upholding of this mindset, supported mostly in patriarchal structures, which has prevented women from even having access to education, is quite shocking. To understand how this all links in with the Greek philosophy of the elements of earth, water, air, and fire, have a look at my video debunking Freud, Aristotle, and virgin births. Hinduism's caste system has also sometimes been interpreted as a form of spiritual hierarchy. Various adaptations and forms of spiritual supremacy have endured throughout many ages and cultures. most notably through monarchical structures that support divine rulership through kingships and emperors. New Testament writings indicate that Jesus did not promote spiritual eugenics, as his teachings emphasized inclusivity, equality, and the inherent worth of all individuals. Throughout the Gospels, he associated with marginalized and outcast groups such as tax collectors, sinners, women, and Samaritans, challenging societal hierarchies and prejudices. His parables and sermons, such as the Beatitudes and the parable of the Good Samaritan, highlight the value of humility, compassion, and actions over status and lineage. Jesus consistently rejected notions of inherent spiritual superiority, teaching that the least will be the last, and that access to God's kingdom is available to anyone who seeks it, regardless of their background, focusing instead on love, grace, and the transformative power of faith. It is teachings such as these that advocates of eugenics relied on to challenge policies. However, when it comes to rejecting spiritual eugenics, Christianity has a bit of a mixed history. And there have been ways in which it has actually supported spiritual hierarchies. For example, the Holy Roman Church has historically exhibited traits by hierarchical structures that implied certain individuals or groups were close to God. During the medieval and early modern periods, the church promoted the idea that clergy, especially the Pope and bishops, held unique spiritual authority and access to divine truth. This hierarchical model often excluded women, non-Christians, and anyone they deemed to be heretics, suggesting that salvation and divine favour were limited to those within the church's control. Practices such as the doctrine of discovery further enforced the notion that certain groups were spiritually inferior and required conversion or subjugation to align with divine will. The doctrine of discovery was a concept in Catholic history that originated in the 15th century, which granted European monarchs the right to claim lands inhabited by non-Christians. It justified European colonisation expansion by asserting that Christian nations had divine mandate to spread Christianity and dominate non-Christian peoples. This doctrine was used to legitimise the colonisation of the Americas, Africa, parts of Asia, leading to the disposition of Indigenous lands and the subjugation of Indigenous people. In some Christian fundamentalist groups, this type of spiritual superiority can be seen by those who accuse others of being Luciferians or Satanists, if you like, just because they disagree with their ideology. This practice aligns with the concept of eugenics in that it seeks to control or eliminate those who are deemed unfit or undesirable based on their beliefs or behaviours. I have had first-hand experience of this with David McKay, and it is not nice. But he is just one of many preachers who do this on a regular basis. Every Sunday, or every day of the week for that matter, preachers stand up on the pulpit and sprout out hatred and condemnation of others based on their ideas of spiritual superiority. By labelling dissenters as evil, devil worshippers, these groups create a moral and spiritual hierarchy, positioning themselves as pure and chosen, while others are cast out as corrupt. This ideological exclusion can serve as a form of spiritual purification, where those who do not conform to the group's beliefs are ostracized, demonized, or otherwise spiritually purged. The use of such labels is a tool of coercive control, aiming to suppress individuality, enforce conformity, maintain rigid ideological structures, much like the goals of eugenics, in its attempt to control those who it considered to be fit or worthy in society. Spiritual eugenics has also presented itself in less expected ways in Christian cults, such as the Children of God and their flirty fishing. On the surface, this practice may not seem like eugenics, but it has a clear connection. Flirty fishing involved women in the group using sexual relationships to recruit new members. often targeting men they deemed spiritually receptive. This practice wasn't just about recruitment, it was also about controlling reproduction. Children born from these unions were seen as spiritually superior, aligning with the cult's vision of creating a pure spiritual lineage. By framing these children as chosen, the cult combined spiritual eugenics with coercive control, exploiting women's bodies and lives to further its agenda. The merging of spiritual eugenics into Christian beliefs is, in my opinion, a result of Greek philosophy being superimposed into scripture. The New Age spirituality movement emerged in the 20th century as a broad, eclectic spiritual movement that blends elements from various religions, metaphysical and philosophical traditions, including Eastern religions, Western esoterics, and Indigenous practices. It emphasizes personal growth, holistic healing, and spiritual enlightenment, focused on empowerment and the interconnectedness of all life for potential human transformation. The movement promotes practices like meditation, yoga, and energy healing while advocating for a cosmic perspective that includes beliefs in reincarnation, karma, and universal energy. It is generally characterized by a non-hierarchical, decentralized approach to spirituality, encouraging personal exploration rather than adherence to dogma or organized religion. However, some cultic groups still have features of spiritual eugenics. It's also good to point out that models of spiritual hierarchies that were introduced by some New Age spirituality cults in the late 1900s coincides with the emergence of eugenics in broader society. This correlation does not necessarily mean causation. It really just goes to illustrate the mindset of Western values during the Victorian era. Today, concepts like indigo children, who are supposedly spiritually superior individuals, hint at a modern subtle form of spiritual eugenics. Similarly, so do groups that promote selective relationships or communities that foster spiritual purity. While these may seem harmless, they often exclude or marginalize those deemed less evolved. Even worse, they can be weaponized by coercive groups to manipulate and control their followers. Scientology presents another explicit example that incorporates spiritual eugenics through its concept of the bridge to total freedom, which ranks individuals based on their spiritual process. Adherents are classified according to what is known as their operating thetan or OT levels, with higher levels signifying greater spiritual power and enlightenment. This stratification creates a system where those who can afford expensive auditing sessions and training are seen as more spiritually advanced. Additionally, Scientology views those outside the church, particularly suppressed persons, as spiritually defective or harmful, reinforcing a dichotomy of spiritual hierarchy and inferiority that aligns with principles of spiritual eugenics. Another example are cultic groups like the Yoshok movement. In the 1980s, a commune in Oregon promoted spiritual eugenics by encouraging selective relationships and sterilizations to create a higher consciousness community. Members who didn't conform were ostracized or punished. The group's leadership used these practices to control members and reinforce their own power. A more recent example is NXIVM, a cult led by Keith Raniere, who framed its practices as self-improvement, but incorporated spiritual eugenics through its secret subgroup of DOS or DOS. Members were coerced into branding rituals and sexual relationships with the group, promoting an ideology of creating elevated individuals who would lead humanity. This manipulation was rooted in the idea of spiritual superiority. All these examples show how eugenics, whether it be biological or spiritual, can be used as a tool of coercive control. Cults exploit the desire for belonging and purpose, using Eurogenic ideologies to justify, manipulate, and abuse. By promoting ideas of purity, superiority, and enlightenment, these groups create hierarchies to keep members dependent and obedient. They isolate followers, limit their autonomy, and exploit their vulnerabilities, all under the guise of spiritual or moral progress. The us versus them mentality is inherent in spiritual Eurogenics, as it creates a divisive framework where one group views themselves as inherently superior in spiritual worth or potential, while demeaning others as lesser or unworthy. This mindset fosters exclusion, often justifying discrimination, coercion, or even violence against those who are considered to be spiritually inferior. By categorizing individuals based on perceived purity, enlightenment, or closeness to a divine ideal, spiritual Eurogenics reinforces rigid hierarchies and alienates those who do not conform to the dominant group standards. This dualistic thinking not only marginalizes the other, but also consolidates power, perpetuating control and justifying oppressive practices under the guise of spiritual righteousness. Such dynamics undermine empathy, equality, and the universal dignity of all individuals, replacing them with fear and superiority. Eurogenics in all forms has left a dark legacy. Recognizing its modern manifestations is critical for resisting these harmful ideologies. In addition to the previously mentioned comments about Jesus preaching Allegorianism, other spiritual traditions that don't adhere to physical or metaphysical Eurogenics include Buddhism, Taoism, humanism, Quakerism, and many indigenous cultures which reject notions of spiritual hierarchies, emphasizing the inherent worth and interconnections of all beings. Buddhism teaches that all sentient beings possess the potential for enlightenment, focusing on individual effort rather than inherent superiority. Taoism values harmony within the Tao, a universal principle accessible to all, and rejects hierarchical notions of spiritual worth. Humanism, a secular philosophy, affirms the dignity and quality of all individuals, grounding ethics in shared human values rather than spiritual hierarchies. Quakerism highlights the inner light, the divine spark present in everyone, fostering equality and rejecting spiritual elitism. Similarly, many Indigenous cultures emphasize the interconnectedness of life, viewing all beings as spiritually significant, rejecting notions of superiority. Together, these belief systems promote inclusivity, mutual respect, and recognition of universal value over hierarchical distinctions. Bottom line is that any form of Eurogenics ideology, whether it is based on physical or spiritual features, is harmful and immoral. Both forms are just about power and domination, and this needs to be called out and recognised as acts of coercive control. My personal view is that human beings, both biologically and spiritually, are products of what I call the creative paradigm, in which I recognise the profound uniqueness of every human individual as being a testament to the wonder of nature. Biologically, each person is the result of an intricate interplay of genetics, environment, and experience, creating a singular being unlike any other. This diversity is not only essential for survival, but also enriches the human experience as it fosters innovation, adaptability, and the dynamic exchange of ideas. Spirituality, I also see with this uniqueness as a reflection of a deeper universal creative impulse, a force that creates individually while connecting us all with a greater part of the whole. Just as no two works of art are identical, or even no two leaves on a tree are the same, each person embodies a distinct expression of life's creative potential. By embracing this perspective, I think we can transcend hierarchical notions of worth and instead appreciate infinite value and beauty inherent in every human being. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about my creative paradigm, you can check out the playlist where I'm putting together some videos on the topic. In those videos, I go through the philosophy, neurological examples, and things like that. Thank you for joining me on this exploration into eugenics, spirituality, and coercive control. If you found this discussion valuable, please consider liking, subscribing, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep raising awareness about these critical issues. See you next time.